Thank you for choosing American Pest CEUs.
Hello everyone, Sean Reeves with American Pest CEUs. I'm an associate certified entomologist and I've been in the pest management industry since 1999.
Course materials written by Jack Launius and Sean Reeves. Inspections, interior, exterior, attics, and crawl spaces. This course covers in depth areas to inspect, including exterior, interior, attic, garage, and sub areas, also the signs of trouble to look for, and often overlooked areas. Several photos are included in the course that help you visualize what you should be looking for. If you are a new inspector or a seasoned professional, you will certainly have something to learn from this course. Inspections, water and moisture. The control of the presence of excessive water, no matter where it comes from, is of primary importance. Rainwater or condensation water runoff, particularly where drainage and grade is poor, excessive ornamental plant irrigation. Atmospheric moisture and leaky plumbing are a few examples of water sources. If water problem sources are ignored, structural damage will invariably result. Using excessive water to irrigate plants adjacent to dwellings and other structures is a common practice in many of the dry areas. Currently, you're seeing a piece of equipment made by Termitrak called the Eye Tracker. We really like this as a humidity sensor. There's not a lot of equipment on the market for this, but this really helps you detect humidity in areas and can lead you to where you need to inspect more. Exterior moisture may also be due to a downspout emptying in a spot where drainage is poor. High, wet soil in a planter, seepage created by a high-angle slope above one side of the house, high exterior grade, vertical cracks in the foundation, low vent bases permitting moisture to flow under the house, cracked vent wells, large vertical openings on either side of a chimney set in the foundation, and many other similar situations. Here's an example from an inspection we performed. As we were going around the home, I noticed something pretty quickly. I actually see here a gutter downspout has become disconnected, as you can see, and it rained a little bit ago, so there's water dripping right out of that downspout. Well, how easy would it be to have somebody fix that gutter downspout so that the water, instead of just going straight down along the foundation, actually comes back down through the downspout and hits this splash block and goes away from the home? Now, as you can imagine, maybe insects like ants, things like that, would still find the water. But isn't it better for things like termites if we divert this water away and we don't put it right on the foundation? So again, just another simple fix that we found that could be related to integrated pest management without even putting out a pesticide. IPM is always about what can we do to solve issues without necessarily putting a bunch of pesticides out that may harm the environment. If a house is located near the coast, moisture from the heavy, wet fog is sucked under shingles, keeping the outer eave sheeting damp. Soil problems. Soil types, textures, depths, and chemistry are all closely related to moisture problems. Obviously, some soils will hold more moisture than others. There are sandy soils that will hold so little water that termites, subs, are virtually unable to survive. For example, where structures are built on old riverbeds and washes, subterranean termites are usually absent. However, there may be areas immediately adjacent where natural watercourses have laid down thick layers of silty clay loam where subs are prevalent. Earth to wood contact. Any direct contact between earth and wood is an invitation to attack by subterranean termites and fungus decay. Some earth-to-wood contacts are readily visible, and some may be inaccessible. Around the exterior of a building, we may find any of a number of wooden structures in contact with the ground. These may include wooden vent frame, a fence or gate post attached to the house or to the garage, wood siding, flower boxes, deck posts and steps, lower steps of wooden staircases, trellis stakes, wooden dividers between concrete or masonry squares in a patio, wooden or stucco covered archways, carport support posts, and many others too numerous to mention. This shows fungus damage at the post. The downspout is a conducive condition that is aiding in the decay. Another thing we need to think about on exterior inspections is the overgrowth issues. As you can see in the photo here, when you get to a structure to inspect and you start noticing that there's trees growing over top of it, dumping all over it, or plants growing up the side, you know you've got some issues that may be above and beyond what a pest control company can solve. That's why it's very important to note overgrowth issues and talk about the things that you're going to need the homeowner or the business owner to work with you on. Some of you may say, well, we do tree trimming and things like that as part of our service, and that's great. Take care of these issues. But I'm going to say 9 times out of 10, most pest control companies don't do this or have the capability. It may even be a great idea to have a partner company that can help you with this, but the reality is when you have major overgrowth like this, you're not going to solve the pest issues if you don't take care of the conditions causing the pest to have entry into the home. One thing you got to be careful of when you're doing exterior inspections is not to miss easy entry points like this. Look around things like hose pipes and penetrations of utilities and plumbing. Make sure they're sealed up. Most of you that have been in pest control any length of time understand that something like this is easy to seal up with a silicone type of caulk, but you got to make sure you find the point to make sure you exclude the insects and or rodents when you go back and do the work. Another interesting thing we came across when inspecting this home was roach droppings up here in the cabinet. So as you can see here, we've got American cockroach droppings all around in this cabinet. So basically that just lets us know that American roaches are a major problem here with that amount of droppings. This is a vacant home, again, in Florida on a canal. They're keeping it about 81 degrees. So it's just one of those things where American roaches are basically having a field day. As part of any good roach inspection, you're definitely going to want to look at areas like under sinks, as you can see here. You're definitely going to want to look at pipe areas. Look and see where roaches may be able to get in and out around pipes. As you can see here, the drywall cutout for the pipe is much bigger than the circumference of the pipe itself. So today we're doing an inspection on a home in Florida where they told us they were seeing cockroaches. And one of the first things I found right in a window frame was an American cockroach on its back. So sometimes it can be really easy to find insect problems like this. It's not always that apparent, but it's nice when you walk in and you look at the right places, especially around windowsills, and you find exactly what they say they were seeing. In thinking about other areas of concern with interior inspections, you need to think about areas like entry doors, windows, pantries, and any areas of food and or moisture. You need to make sure you inspect window frames, trims, and baseboards, as these can be common areas for insects and termites. Another area of importance to us when it comes to inspecting and treating is going to be attic areas. This can be one of the toughest areas to do an inspection for many reasons. We're going to talk about that as we go through the next few slides, especially how to do a good inspection in these areas to make sure you have a successful treatment. One of the first things we need to think about is what our access points to the attic are going to be. Many times if people have a garage on their home, it's going to be pretty easy. You go out into their garage, you find the hatch or the pull down stairs, and you work your way up into the attic. Now keep in mind, one of the things we deal with, even with a garage attic, a lot of older homes are not going to have pull down stairs. So it's always going to be imperative when you're thinking about attic inspections that you carry a ladder with you. And it's really important that you make sure it's a ladder that's going to work for you, that's stable. I can tell you, I've had telescoping ladders before where I've set them up, tried to angle them up into an attic hatch, and I've had the ladder kick out right from underneath me while I was climbing up. You always have to keep in mind that people may be parking their vehicles in a garage and there could be oil deposits from their vehicle. Maybe there was a small oil leak or a fluid leak, and when you put your ladder there, the feet of it on an angle, and you angle it up into an attic hatch, when you start climbing, if that's slippery, that ladder can kick right out from underneath you. You also need to be aware of the fact that you might have to look in other areas for attic openings. Not all homes have garages, as you know. You may need to look in other areas to find the access. Areas to look are typically hallways and bedroom closets, but you're going to need to keep in mind access could be from anywhere inside the house, and you may need to look at every room in the house to find it. A couple of important things on this. So as you may know, attic accesses can be cut by people in their own homes anywhere they want to put them. The reason why I'm saying the garage, the hallway, and the bedroom closets, typically that's about 90% of all your accesses or more, so you don't have to really go looking through the whole house. But what happens when you get to the home where you're not finding it in those areas? You're going to need to look at every room. So go to those areas first, see if you can find the access. Now obviously a lot of homeowners know where their access is, but shockingly I've had a lot of homeowners that don't know where to tell me the access is either. So just keep in mind that you may have to do some looking in that area. You may also find there is no access to some attics. I've had multiple homes in the past 5 years that had no access to the attic at all, and that was really strange. This could be because there's not much clearance in the attic, it's too small, or it can be in some of these newer homes, they ran the ductwork, they sealed it up, and for whatever reason, they just didn't put an access. Keep in mind that you really do want to have access to attics. If you don't, it's going to be very hard to do a good pest control inspection. I've even told people that I recommend you get a contractor in to cut an access to the attic so I can see what's going on up there. Let's talk about the attic hatch area. The first area of importance when you get into the attic is the hatch area. This area is a common area for termites and rodents to be attracted to. One of the reasons for this is because this area usually has some light coming through, contributing to pest migration in the area. If I had to name one pest I most commonly see evidence of in this area, it would definitely be swarming termites. As you can see in the image on the right, I opened up this attic hatch, I walked up there, and as I was going up, I looked over, and boom, right there was drywood termite pellets. I can't tell you how common this is. I'm actually going to show you multiple photos, but it's unbelievable how often I find swarm wings and drywood termite pellets in the attic hatch area. Of course, this is typically because they're attracted to those areas because there is going to be some light coming in. So as you know, when termites swarm, they're going to be looking for light. So the attic hatch area only makes sense when they swarm in an attic that they're going to be looking for light to get back out. Here again is another instance of me going up into an attic area and finding drywood termites in that hatch frame. You can see once again the termites have hollowed out the wood a little bit, and their fecal pellets are sitting right in the hollowed out areas. This can be easy to miss as well. I know you're thinking, well, of course I would catch this, and that's not always true. Because you're going up the ladder, you're thinking about getting in the attic, you're thinking about not falling. One of the hardest areas to look can be right around where you're going into the attic. So always remember, look at these hatch areas and understand that swarming termites especially are going to be attracted to them, and it's going to be very easy for you to miss them if you don't look right around that hatch frame where the light's coming in. When it comes to attic inspections, I find the first 10 feet of my inspection in attic areas to be very important. When I say the first 10 feet, I mean walking in a few steps and scanning the floor space in all directions. Of course, we know the hatch area lets in light and attracts insects. The other common thing I see in the first 10 feet is rodent droppings. This is because rodents are constantly depositing droppings and urine wherever they go. For instance, when I was doing an inspection in this attic, I just had come up through the hatch. I looked over and what did I see right away? Rat droppings. Not just rat droppings, but acorn casings. I was actually able to put 2 and 2 together really quickly because there was oak trees growing right over top of this house that obviously there had been rats that had gotten into the attic area and they were feeding on the acorns. But it was very interesting to me on this one, just like a lot of them, the fact that I walked in the attic, First thing I see is evidence. It's just amazing how often that evidence will be right in your face. I'm not telling anybody not to do a full attic inspection. We always need to do that. But you also have to understand you can see a lot of things in that first 10 feet. This was definitely one of my favorite inspections. Again, I was in the first 10 feet of coming up through the attic hatch, actually right next to it in this case, and I found something very interesting. I found a spot that had rodent droppings, but I don't know if you can tell in this photo, there was actually drywood termite evidence as well. These are the pellets they left behind in the center of the joist. Isn't it amazing? Once again, in that first 10 feet, we found evidence of 2 pests, and we haven't even inspected the whole attic yet. Another problem we have in attics is going to be obstructions and inaccessible areas, specifically things like low clearance. As you can imagine, most attics are large areas. There's a ton of space to be inspected. Unfortunately, attics weren't designed for humans to be traveling in them. When we talk about obstructions and inaccessible areas, you can understand. A lot of times when you're coming through an attic, you're going to see areas, especially down by the eaves, where you really can't get in and inspect. This again is another area where there's going to be light, so obviously insects are going to be attracted to this area. Also around the eave areas from the outside, insects can have the ability to get in, things like swarming termites. So you really have to understand that areas like this are obstructed, and it's something you need to note whether you're doing a graph on the property or think if you're doing a WDO inspection. A lot of times on the forms, you do need to put these obstructed areas, because if not, it may come back on you later that you didn't do a good inspection and now there's termites all over the attic. Remember, you can only see what it looks like while you're there. Anything you can do to protect yourself in the future by making notes on an inspection is a good thing. Also, another major thing we deal with in attics is going to be insulation. This can be in the form of rolled pink insulation or yellow insulation or even white. It can also be blown-in insulation, which may be fiberglass, or it can be the dense cellulose. Either way, there's varying degrees of insulation, different R values, different thicknesses. Just remember, this masks what's going on underneath. So if there's rodent activity or even termites have worked their way down in the wood underneath, you're not really going to see them through this insulation. There again would be another obstruction that you need to put down on your notes, your graphs, whatever paperwork, to let the customer know, and even anybody else from your company, these are areas that I couldn't inspect, and here's why. It's really a true statement when I say the list of things you may find in an attic is never ending. I'm going to show you a couple more things I found on inspections. Always remember that there's no limit to the issues you may see in an attic due to its construction and its general isolation from human activity. If you look at the image on the right, you can see in this case I found more drywood termites and trusses. Now the wood was actually peeling away in this area, which gave it away. Also, you may see at the bottom there's little drywood termite fecal pellets. That really gave this away. Once again, if I didn't do a whole attic inspection, this is something that could easily be missed. This was about halfway through the attic in the center, so it's very important that you inspect the whole attic. Don't think you can skimp on inspections and just inspect half of it or 3/4 of it. Something like this could be easily missed, especially if you're not looking at it from every angle. Or how about these instances? I was going through an attic and I was seeing these like powdery droppings all in a couple different areas. Wouldn't you know it, in this case, both of them were white insulation, so it really made it stick out a little bit. But this is actually powder post beetle frass. So that was very interesting. Once again, very hard to find, very small, isolated areas. If I had not been crawling this whole attic, I would have missed both of these instances of powder post beetle activity. And we have another interesting find. In this case, we were inspecting an attic and found evidence of drywood termites in the form of swarm wings. Once again, as I keep saying, this could have been really easy to miss. It's only going to be through doing a good, diligent inspection that you're going to catch these things and actually be able to present them to the homeowner. Obviously, we've talked about the fact that you don't want to miss things because it can cause issues later. They could even be legal issues. But also, no matter what you're doing, you want to be able to provide the best service to the homeowner. You don't want to miss things like termites because you're really doing them an injustice. Let's say you do miss something simple like this. What happens next year and the year after and the year after that? Who knows? Who knows when they'll get their home inspected again? Who knows anything? So the reality is you could be the only person that goes up there in the next 5 years that's even looking for termites. I've found through the years that a lot of people don't really religiously do inspections unless you tell them to. So finding something simple like this swarm wing can be a really big deal in helping protect the people's home from termites. When it comes to looking for active termites, I always like the TermaTrack system, the TermaTrack T3i and the TermaTrack Eye Tracker, because I really think it tells us a lot about termites. I could tell you that I see termite activity somewhere, whether it's in the form of subterranean termites or drywood termites, but how do I really know if they're still active? Now, if I probe down into an area, I definitely can find out if termites are active, right? As you can see on the video here, we open up an area of drywood termites. We definitely see they're active. That's really easy. But what do you do when you're looking at an area, you're seeing evidence, but you're not sure if it's active now or not? How do you fill out that inspection report? This is where the TermaTrack Eye Tracker really helps us out. They give us the ability to stick the radar system directly on the wood or drywall and detect if there's movement in that area. So for instance, if you're dealing with something like drywood termites, a lot of times you'd see a kick-out hole, something like that, maybe even see the fecal pellets below. But we need more than that to convince the customer sometimes if there's activity in that area. Or think of it like this. What if you treated an area, say with a spot treatment, say you drilled a hole into a wall void, used something like Thermador foam, you saw the kick-out hole, right? You drilled it, you pumped the foam in there, you come back in about 30 days, how can you really prove that the termites aren't active in there? Again, that's where a tool like the TermaTrack Eye Tracker really comes in handy. Performing a crawlspace inspection.
Remember, performing a crawlspace inspection is a complex undertaking. One of the first obstacles you may face is the clearance from the floor joist to the soil grade. As you can imagine, instances where you have less than 18 inches can make crawling these areas virtually impossible. Keep in mind the fact that it's worth all the effort to crawl the tight spaces because you will find issues that need to be resolved. And I tell people this all the time, it's very important to get in these crawl spaces because if you don't, you're not really taking care of your customer. The fact of the matter is that they can be very tight. I've even had instances where we had to dig our way through a crawl space, move soil and different things. But that's where you're going to find the major problems, especially as we're going to talk later about like moisture issues. The closer the floor joists are to the soil, the more problems there can be. So I do understand if it's less than 18 inches, especially, it can be really tough to crawl. But you really want to get underneath there. It's going to be good for your business, good for the customer, and everybody's going to win. Performing the inspection is such a big thing that you even need to take a look at the equipment you might need while you're under there. Making sure you have the right equipment is crucial before you dive into a crawl space. At minimum, I'm going to suggest that you would need to have a flashlight, a crawl suit, and a bump cap. Also carry a cell phone to take photos and call for help in case of an emergency. These are really important things. I can tell you first and foremost, a flashlight is going to be a necessity. You're going to need to see what's going on in the crawl space. You're going to need to be able to shine those walls. Crawl spaces are generally pretty dark, so you're not going to see much of anything with a flashlight. I like a powerful LED flashlight myself. I like ones that are even up to like 50,000 lumens. That's a decision you can make. You can also get some headlamps that work pretty well, that are pretty powerful as well, if you don't want to have have to crawl around with a flashlight in your hand. As far as a bump cap goes, this is just a really good idea. I've been in crawl spaces many times where I've bumped my own head, and I've seen other people do so as well, and it can really hurt when you raise up and hit your head underneath there. So a bump cap just really protects your head. Definitely doesn't look good if you have a nice big red dot on your head when you have to go back in the house. The other thing is a cell phone. Cell phones are great for this type of inspection because you can take photos, and most cell phones even have a good flash on them nowadays, to where you can take a photo even if the lighting's not great and actually save that photo. That's going to be very important for later when you're developing a treatment plan or you're showing your customer exactly what you found down in the crawl space. And again, if there's an emergency, you've got a cell phone. Not that this could happen, but I have seen or heard of cases where people can actually get in a crawl space and get stuck, and they've actually had to call for help. So nothing's like having that phone in your pocket if something happens underneath the crawl space and you do need some help. So the way to get started on the inspection is to enter the crawl space and inspect in a clockwise format. You can see the little diagram we've drawn here where you actually see the crawl entry door. You're going to go in and you can see yellow marks on this diagram to where we're actually showing where you shine the flashlight to all the walls and you take a look at everything. Always do it in a clockwise format to make sure you shine all walls. Now I do understand there can almost be like separate rooms and things inside of a crawl space. It's almost kind of interesting how you can go through a little opening and end up in another room. But keep in mind, if you work in a clockwise format, even if you're in a main crawl space that opens up to a smaller one, you just go into the smaller one, do the clockwise format, come out, and then pick up right where you left off in the main crawl space. But this is a way to make sure you don't miss anything. Inside a crawl space, there's just so many different things that can be going on. You really need to get a full idea of what you can see while you're under there. So go in, do the clockwise format inspection, but keep in mind you're also going to need to write things down when you get out. So you really either got to have like a notebook in your pocket, maybe a little notepad, or have a good memory of the things you see, because once you come out of that crawl space, there's going to be a lot to figure out in your mind when you're drawing a diagram and things like that. And you really want to make sure you note everything. And again, take photos as you go, because this will help you doing the inspection and help you draw the diagram at the end. One of the biggest things you're going to run into in a crawl space is termite activity. Once again, you're going to need to make sure you're shining all walls to look for things like this. You also need to look at the block piers in a crawl space to make sure there's not any activity around those. So as you can see in the photo here, there's some nice big termite tubes that have built up the outside wall of a crawl space here. Piers is the same way. I mean, the block piers that the crawl space sits on, you're going to find activity around those too, especially when it comes to termites. So you need to make sure you shine all these areas. Once again, you're going to need to be looking for things like the tubes. You're going to need to be looking for moisture. Obviously, as you go, you're going to see more and more things. Like in this particular crawl space, the vapor barrier was really broken down. So there's just a laundry list of issues you can come across, but make sure again you're shining all the walls, the piers, and make sure you're keeping a mental note or a notepad to write down your inspection findings when you're done. The photo on this screen is a picture of termite tubes found in a crawl space in Florida. One of the things I want you to be aware of is the fact that drywood termites can also infest crawl spaces. This is going to be most common in the Gulf coastal states to the Carolinas, even places like New Mexico, Arizona, and California. So if you're in the Midwest, the Northeast, the Upper Plains, you're definitely not going to have a problem with this. But it is something to note that there can be drywood termites, and you're going to be looking for things like frass and their fecal pellets in the crawl spaces. In this slide, we're looking at blown-on insulation on crawl space walls. This is another issue I've run across where companies will actually blow cellulose insulation onto crawl space walls. make it stick, and then you can't do an inspection. On this particular home, we actually scraped a gap at the bottom of the walls, and we found a subterranean termite tube. So once again, anything that restricts your inspections, you're going to have to figure out. You may want to ask customers permission like we did on this one, but we told them we really can't do an inspection without doing this, and the whole wall shouldn't have been covered. So once again, blown on insulation like this is a big problem and needs to be removed enough that you can do an inspection. Another interesting thing you're going to come across in crawl spaces is fungi and microbial growth. There's a lot that could be said about these things, and each state has a different idea of how they look at this as far as treatments, as far as what you need to write down on inspections. But I did want to let you know that fungi are common in crawl space inspections. This is especially true in more humid areas in the eastern U.S. and along the Gulf Coast and even in the Pacific Northwest. So if you're in a drier area, say like West Texas or Arizona, California, Nevada, you may not see as much of this because the relative humidity is so much lower. In this photo here, these are fungal spores of a crawl space we observed in the state of Tennessee. But I just wanted everybody to know, really look at the floor joists, look at areas that might have fungi like this. You can even take your finger and smear across them and see if those fungal spores smear, then you're definitely going to know they're active, whereas they could be dead if they don't smear. But again, if you're seeing them, it's better to err on the side that they are active and is something you need to look at performing treatment for. In this slide, I just wanted you to see what some drywood termite evidence looks like. As you look at the photo on the left, you can see where the joists have drywood termite damage with the clean galleries and pellets down below. So the drywood termites definitely aren't leaving any soil in their galleries. They're real clean, and the pellets are dropping below. We're not going to talk a ton about that. We have some other courses on drywood termites if you're interested later. On the right, you're going to see evidence of drywood termite swarm wings. So these are just actual wings from a swarm. So again, these are definitely some things you can come across in crawl spaces in certain parts of the country. On this slide, you're just seeing a couple more examples of fungi. You can just see they're just little plant-like growth that grow on the wood. So whenever you see this, it almost looks like specks, but they're a little bit taller. You're definitely going to know this is fungi you're seeing. Another thing you need to think about when you're doing your inspection is if the fungi is active or not. As you can see in the photo here, you would actually take your finger with your gloves on, rub across the fungi and see if it smears. If it smears, it's definitely active. This is going to help you out when you think about how to remediate problems in the crawl space. If you're dealing with an active fungus, it's definitely different than if you're dealing with one that's dried up. So keep in mind you always want to do the smear test to see if the fungi is active or not. I wanted to talk to you a little more about surface molds and sap-stained fungi. Surface molds discolor the surface of the wood. Surface molds do not weaken the wood, which is very important to know. Surface molds are usually green, black, and orange or powdery in appearance. Concerns with these are respiratory and not structural, and that's a big deal because a lot of people are concerned about microbial growth and how does it affect the structural members of the home. These spore or seeds of surface molds grow quickly on moist wood. Large quantities indicate excessive moisture. Control involves reducing or eliminating the source of moisture. So I want everybody to know again, surface molds can come in multiple colors. I don't really have a photo necessarily of the orange ones. If you've ever seen the orange powder surface molds, they're very interesting. They are a bright orange color. It's kind of impressive what they look like. But I want everybody to know that these are more of a respiratory issue. At the same point in time, most people, if you showed them photos of these, wouldn't be happy that's going on in the crawl space of their home. So you need to just keep in mind as you're thinking about treatment plans, how you can solve these. A lot of the control it basically involves reducing or eliminating the source of moisture, but there's also other things you can do. And if you're seeing large quantities of these, there's definitely a major moisture issue. So you need to be thinking to yourself, What can I do to reduce that moisture? And as we go through the next few slides, we'll talk about some things that you can do to help that problem. In this slide, you're going to see some surface fungi. As you can see on this surface fungi, it's actually a yellowish orange color mixed in with some greens, but it's a real powdery looking fungi. This is something I wanted everybody to see because this is something you will run across in crawl spaces. Typically ones that have a pretty good moisture content, but it's kind of impressive to see. It can even be like a really bright orange, kind of like an orange, the fruit itself, but here it was a little bit discolored. But the point is that you will come across things like this in crawl spaces. We're going to look at wood decay fungi. This is a little bit different because a wood decaying fungus cannot make or capture its own food. It actually feeds off materials such as wood. And I want to stop there because you can figure out in your mind that if it's feeding off the wood, then we've got some major issues that can happen. Obviously, with the name like wood decay fungi, you already know that it's definitely doing some damage to the wood and the structure itself. The wood decay fungi secrete enzymes that break down wood components into sugars. The body of the fungus is made up of long thread-like strands. Strands combine into mats and produce reproductive structures. Severe wood decay can occur in wood with greater than 20% moisture. These are going to break down and compromise the integrity of the wood. So once again, people are definitely concerned about like the respiratory issues we talked about in the last slide, but they're going to be even more concerned when you're breaking down the structural integrity of their wood. So you really need to do a good inspection when it's coming to something like this because structural issues are going to be a big deal. My advice is when it comes to structural issues, I wouldn't stay too much on that with people because most of us are not structural engineers and we really need to think about what we say to people. And if we do think there's a major structural issue, we might suggest that they hire a structural engineer. But I do want you knowing that with severe wood decay, it's usually going to be greater than 20% moisture. So as you're going through crawl spaces, and we're going to even talk about moisture meters, the amount of moisture and percentage is going to be a big deal on telling you kind of what you're running across and what you can do about it. On this screen, you can see photos of brown rot. If you look especially at the photo on the left, you'll see that brown rot can crack perpendicular to the grain. So it actually cracks cross grain on the wood itself.
It's important to note with fungi, it's a living organism that does not require sunlight to grow. Wood decay fungi generally grows in wood with a moisture content of 20% or above. Wood with a 30% moisture content is especially unacceptable. Another great tool you might want to use on inspections would be a moisture sensor like the one made by Termatrac. This device really helped us detect the moisture beneath the wood surface, the relative moisture, also the direct moisture percentage on the outside of the wood. This gives us more evidence of the potential for fungal growth.
Another issue you want to be looking for in your crawl space inspection is going to be sagging insulation. You're always going to want to note sagging insulation on your reports. I can tell you firsthand this is a great way to articulate to your client the depth of the moisture issue in the crawl space. So imagine if somebody came out of your crawl space and showed you a photo like this. You would definitely understand that there must be condensation or something rising up to your floor joist and causing your insulation to sag down. So as that moisture lifts, that condensation, it's making that insulation really heavy and making it sag down. So again, this is something you need to note because as you're looking at crawl spaces and debris, this is something you definitely can't leave on the floor. You wouldn't be able to do any work in the future with all that insulation on the floor. This is another opportunity for you to help your client in something that is going to be a major issue in the future and already is now. I wanted to quickly drop in this slide of a humidity map of the U.S. So as you can see in this slide, you're going to have definitely more humid areas in the southeast, all the way up through the Northeast, the Great Lakes, and the upper Midwest. As you go out west into the desert, you're going to have states like Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada that have a very low relative humidity. So keep this in mind when you're thinking about your inspections, what the humidity is, and how this is going to affect the types of insects you would come across in your area, and including moisture issues in crawl spaces. Let's take a look at wood to ground contact. Wood to ground contact is another important issue to note in a crawl space inspection. Anytime wood touches the ground, it is absorbing moisture from the soil. Termites can easily attack this wood since they can build the tubes right up the sides while having a consistent food source along the way. So many of you have probably seen this where you got some wood to soil contact, and many times, depending on where you're at in the country, you're going to see termites kind of working their way up the wood through the tube. So keep in mind, wood to ground contact is something that you're going to want to note on your inspection sheet, but it's also something that has to be taken care of. It's definitely going to do nothing good in the future, whether it's termites, whether it's wood rot. Everything is going to be able to attack that wood because its proximity to the ground touching there and moisture coming up it. One of the other things you need to note when you're doing your inspection is the condition of the vapor barrier. That's why we titled this slide, Is There an Adequate Vapor Barrier? Now obviously when you're doing your inspections, you're going to look for things like a bunching up of the barrier itself. Maybe it's been pulled back in areas. It can have leaves on it, it can have soil, it can have debris. I mean, there's just 50 different things that can be wrong with a vapor barrier. But you definitely need to note the condition on this because a good vapor barrier is imperative to keeping the moisture down and the condensation from rising up to the floor joist. As we've been mentioning, areas of the country can be more prone to this in the Gulf coastal states, the Northeast, the Midwest, but anywhere you're at in the country, make sure your vapor barrier is good. Make sure you note this on your graph and make sure it's something you look at when you're looking at remediating issues in the crawl space. In this slide, I wanted to show you real quickly a couple photos of vapor barriers. The one on the left is definitely the bad vapor barrier I showed you in the last slide. The one on the right is a good vapor barrier. This one just happens to be in white. A lot of people will use black. As long as it's 6 mil or bigger, that's fine. And in this one, we actually ran it up the piers a little bit and capped it off with some tape. But I wanted you to kind of see the difference real quick of what a good vapor barrier looks like as opposed to a bad one. Moving further along on our inspection, we need to look for things like debris in the crawl space. Debris in a crawl space is obviously another conducive condition. Debris often has cellulose material in it, such as wood. The debris must be marked as part of your inspection on the graph, just like everything else we've talked about. Debris always needs to be removed later. So as you can even see in this photo here, there's definitely things like wood and debris under crawl spaces usually. Any of that is going to be an absolute buffet for termites. So this is an extreme example here of wood in a crawl space, but I can tell you people have things like old boxes, stored items with paper in them. Those are going to be major things to take care of to get rid of or prevent termites in a crawl space. Plus you need to be able to get around under there, and you also need to be able to lay a vapor barrier or at least check the barrier underneath debris to see if it's still good. So definitely part of your plan in the inspection is to write this stuff down and then make a plan later to remove debris in crawl space. I gotta tell you, there's so many things we can look at on inspections of crawl spaces that we could probably be here all day and not list them all. But I did want to mention that now that we've done all this work on the inspection and everything else, make sure you're documenting it well. So we mentioned before that each one of these steps you're finding wrong, you're going to need to document on a graph. For the sake of time in this course, we're not going to go over the whole graphing process, but just make sure you're putting all your findings, again, of termites, general insects, moisture, debris, ventilation issues, and other conducive conditions that are noted. These are the things you're going to need later because you can't really build a good treatment plan without having good documentation of what you found. Then it's much easier to make solutions to solve the problems you have. That takes us to section 3, developing treatment plans for ventilation and moisture issues. As we look at solving ventilation issues, I want to refer to something called International Building Code. I was actually introduced to International Building Code when I got my termite license in Georgia. I hadn't really previously looked at this, but I found some really good ideas in there. One of the things they talk about in International Building Code is ventilation area for crawl spaces with open earth floors. So keep in mind that this is going to be your standard crawl space with the open earth. The net area of ventilation openings for the crawl space with uncovered earth floors shall not be less than 1 square foot for each 150 square feet of crawl space area. So there's going to be some great math to look at here, but just keep in mind that there is an International Building Code, and it does say that we should have at least 1 square foot of ventilation for each 150 square feet of crawl space area. I want to talk a little bit more about calculating the vents needed for a crawl space. So upon calculating the total square footage of a crawl space, you're going to take that number and divide it by 150. This is going to give you the total number of vents required. For instance, a 1,500 square foot crawl space would be 1,500 divided by 150. That would equal 10 total vents needed. So the last calculation is assuming that each vent is 1 square foot each. Keep in mind, you need to know the actual square footage of the vents you put in. But to keep it simple here, I thought we would just make them 1 square foot each. So keep in mind, it's a real simple calculation. You always need to know the square footage of the crawl space, and you're always going to divide that by 150 to get the minimum number of vents you need to have in that crawl space. According to various sources, the floor of a crawl space should have a vapor barrier covering 80 to 90% of the floor space. The goal of the vapor barrier coverage is to stop the condensation from rising up to the floor joist from the soil. The condensation can obviously lead to things like fungal growth and or wood rot. So I just wanted everybody to know that we've talked a lot about the vapor barrier stopping the condensation, but there's reasons why it's set up that way, and especially with the 80 to 90% coverage, what you do is you leave a gap from the edges of like the block walls going a little bit into the soil, because the vapor barrier needs to breathe. So those vents on the outer perimeter need to be able to lift some of that moisture out that comes from underneath the vapor barrier, and it needs to be carried outside. So you really don't want to have 100% vapor barrier coverage, because then every little spot that's not sealed perfectly, that condensation is going to rise straight up. I wanted to talk to everyone about a list of materials you may need when laying a vapor barrier or doing a crawl space encapsulation service. I want you to keep in mind this is not a comprehensive list. You may need other tools based on your style or experience. When you're laying a vapor barrier, it's important to know that there's going to be some artistic work, if you will, on how you do it. So everybody's going to do it a little bit different, but I just wanted to let you know that typical tools are going to be obviously a 6 to 12 mil roll of polyethylene vapor barrier. So obviously you got to have what we call in the industry the plastic itself. You're going to need landscape anchors. So what you're going to do is when you roll out a section of the vapor barrier, you're going to take these and hammer them down so that the barrier doesn't move when you crawl across it or walk across it doing other layers. You need things like scissors. Scissors will cut right through a vapor barrier, so it's really nice. You can actually take the scissors and kind of glide right through it, so you don't even have to really squeeze the scissors, just open them and glide through. It'll cut it really nicely. You need things like seaming tape. So obviously you're going to have multiple sections of the vapor barrier, and you're going to need to seam it together. So I like a 6-inch wide seaming tape. I typically do all my vapor barriers and encapsulations in white, so I'll use a white like seaming tape that's made specifically for vapor barriers. Obviously a tape measure you're going to need. You need to kind of go under, measure like from the outside walls to the first set of piers, and then figure out how wide you need your strip of the vapor barrier to be, and then figure out the length you want, because you're going to obviously want to cut sections at a time. You're definitely not going to go in a 2,000 square foot crawl space, unroll a whole vapor barrier and then make it all fit. You really need to cut it in sections, and then you need to seam it together after you anchor it down. So these are some tools you can think about. Obviously, there may be other things you'll use, but this would kind of be a minimum list of tools. I wanted to let you guys know with the landscape or vapor barrier anchors, as I'm going to call them now, basically they're real simple. I like the ones with the two prongs and the caps like you see here. So we've actually got a nice white cap on this one. Really all you're going to need is a hammer to hammer these down and just make them flat with the ground. So the two prongs are going to hammer into the soil, and then you're going to have a nice flat cap right on top of your vapor barrier. One thing you can do as well is you can overlap the next seam, so you really won't even have to deal with that cap underneath. Obviously there's going to be a row of caps on top, but at least it'll lessen the number of caps, if you will, that you're going to see as you look at the vapor barrier itself. As you can see in the attached photos, I wanted to give you an idea of what the double-sided and the seaming tape looks like. So the double-sided tape's black, and you just peel it off from one side, and then it's going to have stickiness on both sides of the tape. So you're actually going to take it, you're going to attach it to a crawl space wall or a pier, whatever you're trying to attach a vapor barrier to. You're going to stick one side on there, then you're going to pull the second side of the tape to where it's still sticky without touching it, and then you're going to put your vapor barrier against it. You can also see the 6-inch wide white seaming tape here. That's really good for everywhere on the floor. When you cut your vapor barrier, you anchor it down, you're going to have seams, and you need to run this tape down every seam. Once again, what I'm showing you is in white, because I really like white for vapor barriers or crawl space encapsulations. That's up to you if you want to use black or another color. But at least this gives you an idea of what those materials look like and how you're going to use them. Another great solution to solving moisture issues in a crawl space is encapsulating the crawl space. When using this method, you will be adding the vapor barrier to the floor and running it up the walls and the piers. I'm going to tell you this is a great way to seal out moisture. You need to make sure to either add a vent to the main trunk of the ductwork or add a crawl space dehumidifier as part of this. So basically, this is the best solution for sealing up a crawl space. At this point, you're really not letting the moisture in the crawl space at all. Keep in mind that can become like a pressure cooker underneath there though. If you seal it all up and there's nothing moving the air around or kind of taking the moisture out, you could have some major problems and the moisture can actually be worse. So keep in mind something as simple as having an extra vent cut in the main trunk of the ductwork helps. What that does is the inside of the house obviously has the thermostat. That makes the crawl space temperature kind of consistent with the inside of the house, or at least closer. So that definitely helps keep the humidity level down. And obviously a crawl space dehumidifier is not a bad idea. That's going to draw the moisture out of the air. One thing you need to do though, you need to have like a positive drain put in like a low spot in the crawl space where that moisture can kind of drain from that dehumidifier. It's definitely not something you want to go down yourself and have to worry about or dump water out of. But just keep in mind you're going to need something moving air around, you're going to need something to dehumidify. Never ever close up a crawl space this way, but I'm going to tell you as far as solving moisture problems, I've had my best luck when encapsulating the crawl space and not allowing the moisture to get in the first place. Alright, so here's some photos of actual crawl space encapsulation. This is really nice. This is done in a 12 mil white vapor barrier. I really like the 12 mil and I like the white. A lot of people will call these like clean spaces, different things like that. But it's just very important to make it look good like you're seeing here. You're not going to get every ruffle out of the plastic itself, but you can see how well this really is seamed up and how well it's really laying out. One thing that I did notice on this job, that there was no gap at the top of the block foundation to do termite inspections in the future. So looking at it from a pest and termite control point of view, you definitely are going to want to leave a 4-inch gap on the block up at the top to make sure that you can do termite inspections in the future. And probably you wouldn't know this by looking, but there's actually double-sided tape on the back of the poly where it's against the walls. So that's how it's being held up. So a lot of times you wouldn't even think about, you know, what's holding it back there, but there is double-sided tape holding it back in that area. One issue you may need to resolve when doing an encapsulation is, will you need to add foam board insulation to the exterior walls, or is it currently there? let's say that it was currently there. One of the things you may need to do is you may need to cut that gap with like a 1-block path there to be able to do termite inspections, as you see here. Another thing you may look at is, do we need to do insulation? As you can imagine, under floor joist insulation has a lot of problems. It gets wet, it gets moldy, it falls down. Foam board insulation is a great idea. Just keep in mind you have to have your gap to do termite inspections. What you're seeing here is a 2-inch foam board insulation that we anchored with 22 caliber nail guns with washers on it. So I'm not going to talk a lot about that, but I did want to mention it because it's definitely a big part of crawl space inspections and especially encapsulations. As I earlier mentioned, you want to be thinking about an inspection gap at the top of any encapsulation to be able to inspect for termites. As you can see in the photo here, we have a nice little inspection gap at the top where you can actually look and see if there's termite activity. Keep in mind, if termites build their way up and there's a vapor barrier all the way to the top of the block foundation, they're going to work their way right up in there and they're going to get into the sill plate and the floor joist without you ever knowing. So this inspection gap is really important to be able to do future inspections. Let's take a look at our final section, section 4, which is going to be common insects in crawl spaces. It's going to be important for you to know the common insects that inhabit crawl spaces. There's going to be a short list of occasional invaders such as millipedes, earwigs, centipedes, crickets, things like that. This is definitely not a comprehensive list, but you can imagine any insect that really likes moisture is definitely going to be drawn to a crawl space. Plus it gives them a little bit of shelter and it also gives them protection from the outdoor habitat. You'll definitely need to be prepared to come across things like poisonous spiders such as black widows and brown recluse. Of course, you're going to see cellar and cobweb spiders, pretty common ones, but I can tell you firsthand, if you've never come face to face with a black widow in a crawl space, you definitely don't want to because it's not a good sight. I've done it myself. Also, brown recluse, depending on what part of the country you're in, are pretty common in crawl spaces. Many times in the southeast, I've removed a vapor barrier and had brown recluse crawl right out from underneath. I've also seen many types of ants in crawl spaces, including carpenter ants. So again, depending on the part of the country you're in, carpenter ants can be a big problem in a crawl space because they can inhibit the wood just like they would outside or up in the structural members of the home. Looking a little more into general pest control in crawl spaces, this is obviously another issue we're going to need to resolve. As you can imagine, carrying a pump or a backpack sprayer into the crawl space isn't necessarily practical. We talked about that earlier with our BoraCare type of treatments, how you really need a rig-mounted sprayer with a hose or even a portable one you can leave outside. But if you've ever tried to carry a backpack into a crawl space, it's really back-breaking. It's just going to hurt your knees and everything else. It's just really not a practical solution. Once you've determined what types of insects are in the crawl space, you need to look at different types of products such as food-based granular baits and maybe even dust formulations. I know there could be some concern with dust kind of getting up into ventilation systems, so be careful with these types of products. Sometimes people dust things like sill plates and areas like that, maybe closer to the crawl space vents. We mentioned earlier that BoraCare can be a great product for insects in the crawl space as well. Definitely something you might want to look into, and keep in mind you're always going to need to follow the product labels. So anytime you look at doing something in a crawl space, look at the label of the product, make sure of what the precautions are so you don't get yourself and the homeowner in a bad situation. Another technique we want to talk about in controlling insects in crawl spaces is using exclusion techniques. As you can imagine, integrated pest management doesn't stop at the inside and the outside of the home. We definitely want to do things to the crawl space itself to make sure the insects can't get in. One thing you're going to see all the way on the left here is a picture of a crawl space foundation vent with a good screen in it. It's very important that you have a good screen in there. How many insects can you imagine you would keep out just by having a good screen on the foundation vents? In the middle picture, you see a crawl space where the foundation door has fallen in. This is a huge problem. I can't tell you how many times I've come across crawl spaces where the doors have completely fallen in and it's just open to the outside. On the right, you can actually see a newly installed crawl space door. That's what you want. You really want that area to be sealed up well, because it's a lot easier to keep insects out than it is to deal with them after they've already gotten in.
Congratulations, you have completed the course. Please proceed to the 20-question quiz. Please drop us a line and give us your comments on the course, pestceus@gmail.com.